which I've now done. So welcome everyone to our weekly call. And as you will see, we are now recording the call. A fantastic start to the week this week. The sun is shining. It's a nice day, certainly here in the UK. Hopefully it is where you all are. Sad news that we shan't be convening in San Francisco at the end of July, but probably not a great surprise to many of us, but a pity nevertheless. As you would have seen, we have a sort of guest speaker on the call today. So Thomas will sort of come on shortly to give a presentation covering sort of two topics. He's going to talk a little about DNS shotgun, which I was thinking about this earlier today. I know came up in discussions on this call probably about a year ago when people were saying it would be great to have some useful, some suitable test tools to sort of benchmark the performance of DOE. Thomas can tell us what the situation is with DNS shotgun, with encrypted DNS generally, but including DOE. But also to topically sort of resume the conversation, which has, I think, cropped up a few times now, about the relative merits of DOE versus DNS over QUIC or DOC, which I know a few opinions have been expressed on that over the last year, 18 months. So it'll be fascinating to get Thomas's view on that as well. So we sort of kick off with that, and then we'll see, sort of time permitting, if there's anything else that people wish to touch on afterwards. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Thomas, and I'll be driving the slides, but under Thomas's careful direction. So just bear with me whilst I put the share screen on. So I'm now hoping that you can all now see that.
Yeah, looks fine.
Fantastic. So Thomas, thank you for volunteering to talk about this. Over to you. Let's see where the conversation takes us.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Andrew. I'm the maintainer of DNS Shotgun and OpResolver in CZNIC, and I'll dive into these two topics a little bit today. So can we get the next slide, please? So first, a little bit about the origin, why DNS Shotgun even came to exist. So in the past few years, we've seen the rise in interest of encrypted DNS. But the issue is that DOT and DOH are built on top of the TCP protocol, and testing and benchmarking that is radically different from the traditional UDP. And the existing tools like DNSPerf, ResPerf, or Flamethrower, they have certain limitations, and they weren't exactly capable of running the sorts of tests that we are interested in. One of these limitations is the connection management. The tools I mentioned, they typically establish either a single connection or a set of connections at the start of the test. And they basically pool the individual clients represented by the queries they would send together in a single connection, which is radically different from what would happen in production, where every single client would establish its own connection, if not more. Also, the existing tools didn't really allow any tweaking of things like idle timeout or the parameters of TLS or HTTP properties and so on. And the other limitation is query timing. We wanted to run the test as realistically as possible, and query timing has a great impact on, for example, the idle timeout, or on the connection and the management in general, because if a client sends a lot of queries, or if you pool clients together, that's going to affect when the client or the server is going to close the connection. And since establishing the connections is actually very costly, this is quite relevant. And the query timing also affects things like cache hit rate. And the final limitations that we wanted to overcome is actually the number of simultaneous TCP connections that you can have. Typically, the tools I mentioned, they work with hundreds or thousands of connections, but pretty much all of them would hit a limit of 65,000 connections when you run out of ports. Next slide, please. So what we wanted this tool for our own testing of not resolver, because we had implementations of both DOT and DOH, but we didn't actually know beyond a few sanity checks how well do they actually work and how much do they scale. So we wanted this tool to generate traffic patterns and server load that would be similar to production environment. DNS shotgun is not really a simple thing to use. Since doing a realistic benchmark is quite complex. So this is primarily intended at like DNS operators, developers, and researchers, not only because of the time investment that you need to sort of understand and configure what's going on, but also because you need some sort of input data. You need some PCAPs from your clients to get the best results. Next slide, please. So what can DNS shotgun actually do? It takes an input PCAP, which contains traffic from your clients, and it identifies them, and it basically replays and simulates those original clients over the protocol that you select. It supports DNS over UDP, TCP, then DNS over TLS, and DNS over HTTPS. The main feature is that these clients, they establish their own connections, which is quite important, which is the main difference from the other existing tools. There's also no connection limit because you can bind to multiple source addresses. So you just need additional IP addresses that you just add to your network interface. You configure shotgun to use them, and it can establish as many connections as your hardware can handle. You can also customize the client behavior. You can select idle time, TLS versions, HTTP method, and so on. And so when you run this test, in the end, you get measurements, and they include response rate, latency, and various connection statistics. All of this and more you can find out in the comprehensive documentation that also includes some benchmarking tips and basically describes the process, how to use DNS shotgun, and what we did to tweak some of the network stack parameters. Next slide, please. So now a little bit more about DNS encryption in general and the protocols that are available today. First thing I'd like to stress that encryption is not the same thing as privacy. Encryption only protects the data in transit. And in some cases, your privacy might even get worse if you use encryption, especially if you have an application that, for example, a browser that sends the queries to a single target, because all of a sudden you can identify a client, whereas previously, if you didn't have no encryption and you share the network with other clients, your traffic would not be as easily distinguishable. But other people have spoken about this. There's a great blog post that I link here, and I recommend you read it. So the protocols that are available today for DNS encryption are DNS over TLS and DNS over HTTPS, and sort of hopefully in the future DNS over QUIC, but I'll get to that, to the status of that a little bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a quick overview of the network or the protocol stacks that are required for the individual protocols or for the encrypted DNS protocols. So both DOT and DOH is based on the TCP transport protocol, and on top of it, there is a TLS encryption layer. That's the important thing that actually does the encryption. The difference between those two is what happens inside. For DNS over TLS, you just have the simple TCP format that has been with us since the inception of DNS. However, with DNS over HTTPS, you have the entire HTTP protocol, which is a very complex thing, inside the encrypted layer. And then on top of it, you have to build the DNS over HTTPS. I'd also like to mention that the HTTP protocol is not actually one thing, because HTTP2 is radically different from previous versions of HTTP, and HTTP3 is also going to be different. Then you also have some other concerns like different methods, get or post, and in general, it's a very complex and it has very little value in my opinion. And finally, there's DNS over QUIC, which is currently being developed, let's say. The major difference is that it is built on top of UDP, which is beneficial because it removes some of the problems with TCP. On top of the UDP layer, you build the QUIC protocol. Then there's, again, the TLS encryption layer. And then finally, you have DNS over QUIC. Next slide, please. So the main advantage of QUIC is that it's designed for minimal latency, which is a good thing for DNS. It also removes the head-of-line blocking problem that affects the TCP transport protocol. When you don't need the actual vector latency, you actually save one round trip since you don't need the TCP handshake. And even though theoretically TCP fast open exists, it doesn't really work too well in the wild. I'm by no means a DNS over QUIC expert. So I just took a quick look at the RFC, and it seems very complex. It's like over 200 pages of RFC, and it's very complex, similar to DOH. But in this case, I think the complexity might actually be worth it. Whether that is the case or not is up to the measurements. And this is actually something that DNS Shotgun might be able to help with, because it can already measure and compare DNS over UDP, TLS, or HTTPS quite well. And if QUIC support was added, we could compare how it works, what is the cost in terms of latency and server load for these different protocols. Finally, I'd like to quickly mention that some people say that if you have DNS over HTTP3, you no longer need DNS over QUIC, since HTTP3 is using QUIC. One point I'd like to stress is that HTTP3 is by no means free. The resolver implementations, not resolver, unbound, and bind, they use library that does only HTTP2. So it would mean a lot of additional work. And like I said, in my opinion, the HTTP protocol just brings additional complexity increases the attack surface, and have some additional privacy concerns that serve little value, in my opinion. So next slide, please. A little bit about the encrypted DNS status in Node Resolver. We supported DNS over TLS since 2016, and when it was sort of ready to use and released, DOH was sort of starting to emerge. And my first reaction was, why do we need this? We already solved the DNS encryption problem, and I initially disliked it. No, I'm sorry. I got locked out of my computer. Yeah, actually it works fine. Okay, so I initially disliked DOH, but nevertheless we decided to implement it, and it was quite quick to do a first experimental prototype. It took like 2 days to code it, 2 weeks to test it, 2 months to package it, and 2 years to debug it, and then we threw it away. And now we have a new implementation that actually works much better. But what we learned from this is it's quite different to do a single query or point a single browser to the resolver and see if it works versus serving thousands of clients. But back then, there weren't any tools that would allow us to actually test this. So that's one of the reasons that the DNS shotgun actually came to exist as well. Next slide, please. All right, some of the experiences that we've had with DNS shotgun. One of its goals to more accurately simulate the production load was pretty much achieved, because even during the development, we found multiple weird issues with various resolver implementations that would be difficult to reproduce otherwise. And all of a sudden, we had a way to do that. However, it's still not the same as production. And the reason for that is, even though you can customize the individual client behavior, it is still a single implementation of DOH. And it's basically what I think that a well-behaved client would do. But especially with DNS over HTTPS, there are so many ways the client can act and what they can send that it's sort of impossible to simulate all that. Next slide, please. All right, so if you tried DNS shotgun before the version that was released about 2 months ago, I think now would be a good time to give it another try, because the previous versions were sort of alpha, beta. They didn't really have all the features that we wanted it to have. So the current version, I consider pretty much finished. It has a UI and configuration. It can do IPv4 and 6. It supports UDP, TCP, DOT, and DOH. And one of the interesting features that I didn't mention yet is that you can actually configure a DNS shotgun to simulate the clients via different protocols at the same during the same test run. So you can say 80% of my clients use UDP, 10% use DOT, and 10% use DOH. And you can run this simulation at the same time, and you get the results at the end for each of those protocols. It also now has comprehensive documentation that describes pretty much everything that we did and that the DNS shotgun is capable of. Next slide, please. So one thing that will probably appear in DNS Shotgun in the future is some improved automation support, because one of things that we want to do is to make DNS Shotgun part of our continuous integration, to basically be able to do some benchmarks automatically without running them manually. So I expect we will probably add some machine readable output from some of the tools. But besides this, no major developments are planned right now. But something that we would definitely love to add in the future would be a support for DNS over QUIC. Because I think that a year or two from now, we will be in a similar situation that we were with DOH a year ago. That is, there will be some resolver implementations that support it, and I think there are some even now, but we will have no idea how well they scale, how the protocol compares to other protocols like DOT and DOH. So I think this would be a great addition to DNS Shotgun. However, developing free software still takes money, so we are looking for sponsors, and not only for this, but if you try DNS Shotgun and find something is missing or something you'd like to add, we can certainly discuss that as well. So with that, that's everything from me, and now would be a good time for some questions and discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas, for that very rapid run through. I'm sure that will have raised some questions either on doc versus DO, or indeed on DNS Shotgun. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, you can follow what Kurt has already done, which is quite impressive. I was about to say so, which is to you can raise questions in the chat and I'll be happy to read them out. Equally, you can use the Zoom facility to raise your virtual hand, and I will attempt to come to those in the order that the hands are raised. And I'm sure, in addition to any questions, Thomas even would love to hear from anyone that wants to talk about sponsorship for development of the DOQ capability, amongst other things. So raise your questions. Raise your hand if you've got any questions, or put them in the chat. But whilst you're thinking about that, let's firstly go to the question Kurt has raised. Which is, do you have some graphs that show the different server performance of all the variants? So I'm not sure whether you've got anything you could show right now, Thomas, but I don't know whether you could perhaps even comment on the differences in performance of the variants.
So you can think of DNS Shotgun as an experimentation tool. And it's only, the results you get is only as good as the data that you feed it. So the results will greatly depend on the behavior of your clients. However, it depends what you want to know, because you will have different server load from the perspective of the operator, and from the perspective of the client, you're probably interested in the latency of your queries. And I linked in the chat the comparison of the protocols in terms of latency. And I think that is an interesting chart. I'm not going to explain it. I think the explanation is in the documentation. It's a little bit complex, but basically what it shows that for DOT or DOH or even TCP, obviously, there is a cost when you need to establish the connection. And if you have already an established connection, there is no overhead, but for some queries, inevitably, you'll have to establish it, and that's where the extra latency comes in. So yeah, you can basically experiment around with the tool and see what results you get.
So you have a suitable graph to have. So it's useful. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Kurt. Do other people have questions? I can see John has raised his hand. So do you want to come in, John?
Hi. Thanks for the tool, by the way. This is it's very useful, and I've looked at it once, and I will go back personally and look at it again. I know that it seemed to be almost ready for prime time a while back, but hearing that it's finished is good news. My question is that it currently takes PCAPs as an input. Is that correct? Is there any plan on looking at DNS tap as an input?
Okay, so the input is basically PCAP, but it is then pre-processed into this. But you feed the shotgun PCAP, and then it extracts the clients it finds inside of them, and then it transforms into another PCAP specifically for shotgun. But the basic input is PCAP, and that is then pre-processed. And at this time, we do not have a plan to support other input formats.
Okay, so I understand that. I guess I didn't phrase the question correctly. To get a distribution to actually simulate customer load, there's of course percentage that's UDP, there's a percentage that's TCP, there's a percentage that's TLS or DOT rather, and then there's a percentage that's DOH on our infrastructure. I'm with Quad 9. It would be, it's a challenge, of course, to strip IP addresses out of that, but there's other data sets that we can get that are not as private, and it would be interesting just to collect that data in its raw form with DNS tap and then just feed it into Shotgun. So we didn't have to split it up, because as an example, DOH has different characteristics as far how many queries are sent over a particular socket than raw TCP, and simulating that or having to create, I think you call them pellets, right? Having to simulate pellets with each model in a non-real world condition seems to be a lot of work. If we already have it with a DNS tap interface, or we could have it with DNS tap with tagging.
Well, the thing is, DNS Shotgun doesn't do one-to-one replay. So, and also one of the limitations that in the input PCAP, it only takes the DNS over UDP clients, because I didn't want to deal with all the encrypted stuff in this. If you just make it more complex, and if you, so basically you feed it the data, and it has to have the IP addresses, but they can be anonymized, but in the way that preserves basically the streams from individual clients. Otherwise, you distort the data. But once you have this data, then you can choose the parameters for the replay. And these parameters, they could be affected by, you can basically choose them based on the data that you see in your DOT and DOH traffic.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I can see Peter Van Dyke has raised a question in the chat that Thomas, you mentioned looking for a sponsor for DOQ in Shotgun, but do you have plans for DOQ in the NOT resolver?
Well, hopefully. I hope the future will be more DNS over QUIC rather than the other protocols. But I think the better approach is to first implement it in Shotgun, so we have a tool to actually test and benchmark, and then implement it in NOT resolver as well if it seems a reasonable thing to do. It's very similar to what we did with DOH. Once we saw that our implementation that was experimental was quite bad because we measured it with DNS Shotgun, then we wrote the new implementation of DOH. So I think if DOQ becomes more widespread, we will definitely implement it in both.
Thank you. Okay, and I can see that Ralph has raised his hand. So Ralph, do you want to unmute and come on?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk and for the toolings. I mean, I looked at it quite some time ago when it probably had more rough edges, but we'll look at it again. Echoing what John said, I mean, maybe what would be a good enhancement for the tool would to have a meta format like DNS per, for instance, has, where you have just anything that can generate that data easily, that you can use as an input to it. And the other specific question I had, when I looked at it, it required sort of to run stuff out of Docker, which is a virtualization layer, which affects performance. So is it possible to run really on bare metal?
Certainly, you can run DNS shotgun without Docker. The Docker is just provided as a utility. The only dependency that you need is DNS cheat, but I think you can get it for most distributions easily nowadays. So it's definitely possible. And for the first question, if it's possible to generate traffic, well, yes and no. Basically, we want the simulation to be as realistic as possible. So that's why we chose to replay traffic rather than generate it. However, a DNS shotgun can work with any PCAP that you feed it, and you can generate the PCAP on the fly. However, generating this sort of traffic artificially is at this point outside of the scope of DNS shotgun, but it is possible if you have the scripts and the will to do that.
But there is no intermediate format that you already have that someone could use a tool to write stuff against it?
There is no format. The basic, no intermediate format. The format that it takes is basically PCAP that you pre-process into, well, I suppose you could call it intermediary format for DNS shotgun, but it is still PCAP. But it's pre-processed in a way. But at the start of the processing chain, if you feed it some artificial data generated in some way, for example, using DNS cheat or using some other scripts, I think in the master branch, we actually have some way to generate like the same query over and over as a basic sanity check. So you could generate some sort of artificial traffic.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Ralph. I've got Peter, then Brett in the queue. So Peter, do you want to come on next?
Yeah, just a quick note to Ralph about Docker. You can run individual containers in host networking mode, which takes away all the networking overhead that Docker normally comes with. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah, one more addition to that. We actually do exactly that. We run Docker without its network layer, and it seems to perform quite well.
Great, thank you for that pointer, Peter. I see Brett is in the queue next. So Brett, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, it's not really a question, more a comment of something that I think. First of all, thanks for inventing and making DNS shotgun. I think it's a fantastic tool. I haven't, as many other people have said, I looked at it quite a while ago. I haven't looked at it recently. It looks like it's come on in leaps and bounds. So we'll definitely be looking more at it in a not too distant future. One of the things that Nominate operate as part of our recursive infrastructure we run for the UK government is we do some a version of DOH which includes client certificate authentication. Now, obviously, this is quite an unusual thing to do. Nobody else does it, or not that I'm aware of anyway. So it wouldn't be something that I would expect to be in DNS shotgun to be able to test that kind of functionality, but I think it's something we would like to see in there. So perhaps this might be an opportunity for us to talk to you about that and potentially act as a sponsor to be able to get that kind of functionality added.
Yeah, I think DNS shotgun doesn't actually check the certificates even from the client side. It basically treats all certificates as it just takes them and trusts them. So it could probably be implemented. I'm not sure how difficult would it be to to add the verification on the client certificate. But basically, you would need the DNS shotgun to send the client certificates, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe it's something for us to connect on outside the call, and I can put you in touch with the right people at Nominate who would be interested in getting this up and running.
Yeah, sure. You can get in touch. I think there's email address.
Yeah, thank you.
Presentation.
Yeah, I can certainly sort of put you in touch directly with each other after the call to help that. Great, thank you, Brett. In fact, since you touched on sort of sponsorship, I know some while back, Glenn, if he's on the call, still talked about the Comcast Innovation Fund, which I think had helped fund some early developments in DNS Shotgun. I don't know, Glenn, whether the Innovation Fund is still a thing and whether that's therefore something that potentially Thomas and colleagues could apply for additional sponsorship to develop DOQ support within Shotgun.
So let me say, the Innovation Fund very much is a thing. We've been active now for, gosh, I think it's, well, at least since 2014, maybe not before. So it's been around for a while. We continue to give grants, and we're available at innovationfund.comcast.com for people to apply.
Yes, and I would like
and we have happily helped sponsor Shotgun in the past.
Yes, I would like to thank the Comcast Innovation Fund, since they did sponsor the work on TCP, DOT, and DOH for Shotgun. We'll probably apply in the future for DOQ as well.
Thanks. Thanks for confirming that, Glenn. That's helpful. And a note for everybody else, if there's sponsorship needs, that fund exists and has done many good things in the past. Jim, I see you got your hand raised. So do you want to come off mute and make your comment or ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's just another potential source of funding. RIPE NCC has got some funding for open source community tool building projects of various sorts, and there's quite a bit of money set aside for that. So, Thomas, that could be another source of funding for your project. A bunch of your colleagues in NextCZ will know who to talk to the NCC about this, but if not, I can follow up with some details for that.
Yeah, it would be great if you could send me some sort of link or some pointers to that. I would very much appreciate it.
Sure thing, will do.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Good to know that there's money out there to help continue with the development work then, Thomas. Does anybody else have any questions or comments you want to come in on? Because now will be a good chance to do that whilst Thomas is with us on the call. Give you a moment just to give some reflections. And whilst people are thinking, Thomas, just one thing I was going to ask you about, I think you, from your comments, you found DOE pretty difficult to implement comprehensively and reliably within a Shotgun. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, just to bring that to life a little bit in terms of, with hindsight, what the major challenges were. Or are they so terrible you don't particularly want to relive them?
Yeah. Well, the implementation of HTTP2 in particular, because earlier versions of HTTP don't make any sense. It's quite difficult because we have to use some lower level libraries. And all the resolver implementations, they chose to do that. And you basically have to understand the HTTP2 protocol in order to use those libraries. And the protocol is very complex, and handling all the edge cases is near impossible. And my main issue with it is that we already have encrypted DNS with DOT. And in my view, DOH doesn't add anything extra. So all of this work that we spent a year or two on getting it right in DNS Shotgun and in Not Resolver, and it's still an ongoing work. And all of this is basically for very little value because this extra complexity not only costs development time, but it also increases the attack surface. There are some additional privacy concerns because you send all the HTTP metadata, which allows better fingerprinting of the clients. And in general, I just think that there are better answers to encrypting DNS rather than DNS over HTTPS.
Thank you. A bit just useful just to expand on that from a sort of actual hands-on point of view, because various people have given their views from a theoretical standpoint, but to actually hear that from the sort of the coalface of implementation, I think is quite valuable. So thank you for that. Right, last chance for any questions for Thomas before we move on. I'm not seeing any hands raised. I can't see anything else in the chat. So Thomas, thank you for taking the time out to do that. And I'll make sure you got Brett and Jim's contact details to follow up on their sort of suggestions about additional sponsorship opportunities. So hopefully that will make it worth your while having spent the time preparing the slides for today. So thank you for that.
Sure, glad to be here.
And you're welcome to stay on the call, obviously. But let's, at that point, move on and take us on to any other business. I mentioned earlier, as it was sort of came up late yesterday UK time, that we saw a confirmation that ITF 111 will be an online event again. So potentially ITF 112 might be the next sort of face-to-face ITF event in November in Madrid. Shame it's not in the sort of spring or summer in Madrid, but Madrid's always a nice place to be, irrespective of the time of year. So that's sort of come up this week. I put a few other bits and pieces in the sort of news headlines that people would have seen earlier on today, so hopefully that was of interest. But is there anything that anyone else wants to bring up whilst we're gathered on the call today? Because if so, now's a great time to do so. Whilst you're thinking, the one other thing I'm just checking on with colleagues in Mozilla is whether there's any update on their sort of public consultation on the trusted recursive resolver policy, which you may all recall completed back in the third week of January. So I'm just waiting to hear back from the Mozilla team if they've got a time frame that they're able to share, or when the results from that might be arising. So if I hear back from them on that, I will let you know. I see Glenn has raised his hand, so do you want to jump on, Glenn?
Yeah, I just want to be the first to say the upcoming draft cutoff date for ITF 111 is going to be July 12th. And so you have several months, but I want to be the first to warn everybody there's a cutoff coming.
And I'll be the first to comment that I'm sure that there will be little or no documents lodged until roughly 10 to midnight on that day, just to keep things exciting for the chairs.
Yeah, the one thing an ITF needs is an automatic unsubscribe for a 24-hour window around the draft cutoff date, because those of us that subscribe to that list do not want to be inundated like we are every third of the year.
Yes, I think those cut-offs are living proof of the saying, if it wasn't for the last minute, nothing would ever get done. But I guess that's the point of having the thrice yearly sessions, just to really sort of put some impetus behind the activity and actually sort of bring stuff to fruition. But thank you for that timely reminder. So everyone's had plenty of advance notice that is coming up for IETF 111. Is there anything else that anyone wants to raise whilst we're on the call today? One last chance for that. I'll take that as a no. In which case, some of you, I'll just maybe highlight that later on this week, we've got the RIPE DNS working group coming up on the Wednesday. So hopefully I'll see some of you on that session. If anyone's interested in that and doesn't have the details, drop me a line offline. I will happily share that. But other than that, have a fantastic week, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks particularly to Thomas for giving us an update on DNS Shotgun and talking about the pros and cons of Doc versus Do. And we'll see everyone same time next week. Have a great week all. Thank you.
Bye all.